Good morning, everybody. This is the February 12th Ann Arbor Democratic Club programming session in 2022. And today we have a programming session around the American Rescue Plan Fund Act funds, ARPA, in our community. Washtenaw County as a whole is getting over $100 million to different jurisdictions. And we have an amazing opportunity to learn from each other in how different jurisdictions are doing their community engagement and doing their decision-making processes. So being the Ann Arbor Democratic Club, we thought we could hear from some neighbors who have different methods than what we were doing locally in our city, but also hear about how our city is doing community engagement too. As Democrats, we really value the voices of the people living in our community, and for all of us who are public servants or aspiring public servants, we really do want to serve the public and what they really want. So we are also lucky that on the Ann Arbor Democratic Club board, we have an expert in ARPA funding who is actually serving another jurisdiction in a different part of the country. And so we're going to have our board member, Ingrid Alt, start us off with a little overview of what is ARPA, what are the funding purposes, and then we'll introduce our panelists as we get started with the discussion. Now to you, Ingrid.
Hi, thank you. So I am going to give you just a little overview of what ARPA funding is. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Here we go. Right. Hang on. All right. Maybe. Okay. Are we there yet? Okay, here we go. Okay, so American Rescue Plan Act. We're going to focus on the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. Maybe. Are you seeing the screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. Of course, now, why is it? There we go. Why is the screen not advancing?
Sometimes oh, yep, there you go.
Okay. All right. So, oh my God, I've got to move you guys over so I can see everything better. Okay. So the funding was signed into law on March 11th. It's a very large bill of 1.9 trillion. It allowed state, local, and tribal funds to have all kinds of allocations to spend. There are many pots designated. You know, the stimulus money that everybody received was part of it. There's the emergency prevention rental assistance money. There's the housing assistance fund. And then there's the money that we're going to talk about today, which is the CSLFRF, which I have already forgotten what that stands for. There's so many acronyms in all of this, but that's what we're going to focus on today. And what's really important to understand about this money is there was the CARES Act money, which was designated in 2020. And, you know, they gave that a really tight window to spend. And they realized that it just was, it didn't work real well. So what they did was they gave everybody a lot more time to think about it. And the allocation is slowed way down. So now we don't have to make any determinations on how we're going to spend this money until December 31st, 2024, so that we can be thoughtful about this. And then we have until 2026 to actually spend the money. All right. Sorry, I don't know why this is going so slow. Doop, doop, doop. What's going on? I'm not looking very professional here, am I? All right, this is frustrating.
Yeah, I don't really know. Sometimes there's like a different window that you have to share for the presentation versus the file itself.
Oh, I'm frustrated. All right, maybe I'll just, oh, you know, I worked really hard on this dang presentation too.
You got this, Ingrid.
What? All right, I can't even escape out of it now. This is not going good.
I'm going to pause the recording for just a second.
Sorry. Okay, so what dictates how you spend the money is Treasury. So with all federal grants, it's very complicated. There's all these other things you have to worry about, but particularly with this funding, it started with what was called the interim final rule, and then during the last year, there was an opportunity for people to submit questions, and over 15,000 comments were recorded. And then on January 6th, the final rule hit. And now we're going to be working under the final rule, which is the guidance that Treasury has supplied for how we're going to be spending these funds. What's really lovely is beginning on April, I think it's 15th, all guidance is going to be moving forward using the final rule. And what's wonderful is it provides much broader flexibility and greater simplicity in using these funds. So there's more eligible uses, the classes of, there's more eligible classes for beneficiaries, and there's even more eligible capital expenditures, where it was really hard to fund capital projects. Now it's easier. And the other thing that's really interesting is Treasury's determined that everybody has been affected by the pandemic. So everybody would be eligible for behavioral health services. So what are the uses and purposes? Well, there are 7 categories that fall under the eligible uses, and there are 66 subcategories. It seems very daunting and overwhelming, and it is. But under the final rule, under the summary, this is the overarching principles that you have to meet. Fight the pandemic and support families and businesses struggling with its public health and economic impacts. Maintain vital public services even amid declines in revenue, and build a strong and resilient and equitable recovery by making investments that support long-term growth and opportunity. So having said all of that, what does this really mean? So there are 4 basic areas that you work under these funding rules. One of them is replacing lost revenue. And this is where municipalities can decide to replace revenue that they've lost over the last year. And you can do it in 2 ways. You can take up to 10 million if you have lost over 10 million or up to 10 million or above, and you can prove that. Or if you haven't lost that amount, you can use Treasury's formula. And once you've taken that amount, it doesn't matter how you can use it for any reason, whether it's an eligible use or not. So that's one of the really nice things about lost revenue. And that's category number 6, because we talked about the different categories and subcategories. Then categories 1, 2, and 3 are for public health and economic impacts. And for that, you have to figure out whether it's a public health or an economic impact, and then you figure out who it services. And then these are some of the different categories, who's been impacted, and then you build your program around it. And this is the area that I'm really the expert in, because these are the programs that I've been working on. And what I thought I would do is I'd show you some of the different kinds of programs that I've written. I work as a contractor for King County, which is in Seattle, Washington, and I manage about $150 million of their programming. And these are some examples of some of the kinds of programs that I've written. So I've written the very first program I wrote was testing and vaccination for their jails. And then I wrote some funding for people who were tested positive and they needed $1,500 to isolate and quarantine safely. Anyway, those are some of the examples of programs that I've written. Another category is premium pay, which is category number 4. And this is for the essential workers who just don't make very much money. And this is a way to fill the gap. This is an unfortunate category because very few municipalities have taken advantage of this. I did a lot of research on this, and I've actually written a policy paper about this. Most municipalities have shied away from this. The 5th category is water, sewer, and broadband. This is an interesting, I think the county is doing this. I'm really thrilled to see that this is something we're taking seriously, because broadband is really something that rural communities are suffering from. And I believe the city is also doing some, or proposing some sewer, which is really important too. I mean, we all know what's going on in Michigan. And then some of the requirements that local governments have to adhere to under this funding, and there's lots of them, but these are some of the highlights. Is you have, of course, meet the eligibility requirements of the final rule. It's complicated. It took me months to learn this. The final rule is over 500 pages long. The interim final rule was 151 pages long. So it became much more dense, but again, it became much more broad in scope. So even though it's longer, it encompasses and makes it easier, even though that sounds opposite of what it could be. There's quarterly and annual reporting. The annual report is the one that has to go up on the website so that everybody has the ability to be informed. And then audits, anytime your funding is over 750,000, audits are required. So anyway, there's a brief overview. I hope that was helpful. It's very hard to condense all of this down into something that makes sense for everybody. And I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. So we will take questions in the chat. I think let's start with the panelists and ask each panelist to introduce yourself and what group you represent or what jurisdiction you represent, and to please be very brief, and then we'll come back around and ask everybody to tell us your story of how you're doing community engagement. So let's start by just introducing folks. And I'm on my screen, I see Commissioner Shink, and then Community Member Thomas, and then Trustee Lindke. So we'll go in that order. Commissioner Shink, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, so I'm Sue Shink. I think everybody knows me. And I represent District 2, which includes a tiny part of Ann Arbor, about 1,000 people, and then is north, including Webster, Northfield, Ann Arbor Township, Salem, and Superior Townships. And then I am also serving as chair of the board. And so I have spent an incredible amount of time over the past year working on our ARPA rollout.
Thank you very much. Community Member Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie, for inviting me. Ann Arbor Democratic Party. I'm Alex Thomas. I am representing the Whitetown ARPA Committee, which is a citizens-led group of residents in Ypsilanti Township. I always like to point out Ypsilanti Township's 55,000 people. The city that I love, the city of Ypsilanti, is 21,000, but us being almost 3 times larger, 7.5 times larger geographically, I think a lot of times we get lost in the conversation. So I'm really here to speak to what we're doing for those residents in that 55,000 person township. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Lindke.
There we go. Hi, I'm Bernice Lindke, and I'm a newly minted trustee for Superior Township, at least for the last year. So I've been getting up to speed on the ARPA funding. We have some interesting things going on in Superior Township, which I'll be glad to share.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. let's start with a question for each of you to answer, maybe about 5 minutes max, to tell your story of, you're as a jurisdiction community member or leader, you have funds coming and there's this timeline where decisions have to be made by 2024 and funds have to be spent by 2026. Here we are, it's 2022. Last year, there were a lot of discussions in 2021. How did your colleagues, community members, how did you think about planning for community engagement during the last year and going forward? So let's start with you, Commissioner Shink.
Well, thank you. And I also want to thank you for having this panel. It's pretty exciting to be able to talk about it with you and also to hear everybody else's story. So we started, hearing about the money back in January, and it was pretty exciting. We've been working in a very resource constrained environment for the entire time I had been a commissioner, and so there were a lot of ideas that commissioners had and that residents and staff people had, but we didn't really have the money to make them happen. So when we heard about the money, we started thinking about how we could use this to the best effect for our community. And there was a broad general agreement that we wanted this to be transformative. We didn't want to fill holes in the budget. And there are, that back in 2012, the county had really constricted its spending because of the downturn in the economy. And so we just decided to break out and think broadly about how this could be most useful and most effective for the community. And so what we promised ourselves in the community was robust community engagement, and that the commissioners would take responsibility for voting on each expenditure. So we weren't going to pass it off to staff. We wanted staff input, but we weren't going to pass the responsibility to anybody else. We thought we are the ones who are elected. We are accountable to the community. And so that's where the responsibility needs to lie. We also talked about facilitation as opposed to gatekeeping, so that we wanted to bring all the ideas in the community to the table, and then we would figure out together what was the best approach, not try to shut things out from the beginning. And so we considered hiring a consultant to help us with the outreach, but time was of the essence, more so then than now even, but we know it's important to get the money out into the community. And so we're really fortunate because we had already been working on increasing our public engagement. I'm going to give a lot of credit to Commissioner Morgan for that one. And we've been working on that. And so we also have a communications person Peter Lindeman, who that's his thing, communications, community outreach, and evaluation, which will become important later. So looking through resources, I'm not sure where, I found a survey from Alexandria, Virginia, and I thought, wow, this is so easy. We can just copy that. So really we did, adjusting it to Washtenaw County. And so we also developed a background document and called it the Washtenaw County Rescue Plan. So it's based on needs we knew. We had reached out to department heads and electeds for input, asked staff for input, reached out to local organizations. So there were lots of phone calls, lots of meetings, and so we had a list. Not going to go through it all, but it has kind of all the possibilities that we saw. And then every time we talked to people, we kept saying, hey, if you have an idea we haven't thought of, please, we want to hear about this, because we want to be really effective. And so this background document, we made it available to the public. We put that survey out, and it was open for structured input, but also for unstructured input. We had a special link that called it what it was. And then we also distributed paper copies through trusted community members to people who weren't necessarily going to be finding it on the internet. We had town halls. Every commissioner had at least one. Some had more. We put out press releases, social media posts. We did interviews with WEMU and MLive, and there were other ones that I couldn't remember, but I'm going to take all my time anyway. We did presentations to our local electeds, to township boards, and some organizations. And then we were working hard toward a September vote. And part of that was because we had been investing a lot of money in getting ready for funding that could be used for broadband. When we made those investments, don't know, it was maybe 3 years ago. We did not know when that money would become available. But broadband, lack of broadband is a problem across the county. So it's a problem in Pittsfield, Ypsilanti Township, in Northfield Township, all the Western Townships. So Augusta Township too, like everybody, most everybody in the more rural-ish areas benefited from the allocation. And we also understood that if we could get that funding in earlier, we were in a better position because we knew that the entire country eventually was going to be making this move. So we wanted to be one of the first communities so that we weren't waiting years on ends for supply chain issues. So we got together a package that addressed some really immediate needs. Another immediate need was, I will go back to broadband because it's been more controversial than most of the things that we did. We had also been hearing from these families of sitting in cars outside a hot spot in the freezing cold, trying to help their kids do their homework. And that's unacceptable. So the other thing was teachers and business people. It was just, we really, for the last several years, have really needed broadband even more than usual to make things happen. So we also had some immediate issues around childcare access because the schools were backing away from childcare that they had been providing pre-pandemic. And then we wanted to allocate, and this, I think I skipped ahead. I get so excited sometimes about this stuff. So for our package, I'm talking about the package that we put together for September. So we had children's savings accounts, which are going to take a while to operationalize, but basically kids who get free and reduced lunch at public school are going to be getting $500 in a children's savings account that goes toward post-high school education. And other kids who don't qualify for that will be getting about $25, which is the minimum allowed by law. So every kid will get it. It encourages kids who weren't likely to go to college or secondary training. 40% more will go just for having that account if nothing else happens. But we're not stopping there. We're going to keep working to support kids so that we can get more of our kids into secondary schooling and out of poverty. We also allocated money toward weatherization. It's a climate action as well as a quality of life issue for quite a few of our residents. And then the lost revenue aspect of the American Rescue Plan really allows us to take money that we get and make it more flexible. So it almost becomes like general fund money. So we were able to shift things around and make it work. At that point, we heard from people that they wanted more input. Some neighborhoods that typically don't get as much attention as they need wanted some one-on-one sessions, and those were super successful. We had, I don't know how many people we had, but we always had about 30 or more. We had 3 of those sessions, one on the south side of Ypsi. That was the weather was terrible. It wasn't really safe to drive and people still came out in droves. We had one at Sugarbrook and one at Sycamore Meadows, Danbury Green, which is in Superior Township. And we heard some of the same things we'd been hearing, but we really heard a lot. Kids need something to do after school. We need affordable housing. Our neighborhoods need more attention in general, and especially around Sycamore Meadows. But I'd say everywhere people were talking about the value that a community center could bring to the neighborhood. And then we also heard a lot about a community priority fund that would be flexible and be able to fund some of the smaller organizations that are really doing a lot of good work in the community, but maybe aren't rising up to the level in terms of organizational capacity as, say, United Way or Avalon Housing. And so we had always been wanting to do something like that. But as I was looking through the old rescue plan, it was about $1 million. It's now up to $8 million. So we heard loud and clear that people wanted this, and we responded because that's what we're here for.
So Commissioner Shink, we'll talk a little bit more about methods of community engagement. And then we'll talk a little bit about priorities if there's time after that. But we do really want to focus on how did you hear from folks and how are you using what you heard in your decision making? So let's hear the story, the kind of overarching story from Ypsi Township and Superior Township. And then we'll come back around with some methods questions. So Alex, do you want to share just, you're different from the other folks on the panel as not an elected official, but a community member who is pushing for community engagement. And I'm wondering if you could explain to us how come you formed a group to do community engagement, and please explain also what is happening and what's the timeline that's been shared in the public with Ypsi Township.
Thank you, and I'd love to. And first, I want to also thank Commissioner Shink, also Commissioner Morgan, Commissioner Justin Hodge. The county's outreach efforts in the ARPA discussion, they really have been, I think, in a real difficult environment, doing the best they could to hear from community members. In my neighborhood, in West Willow, they held a session, and many people ask me my thoughts on what's the Ypsi Township story. I can't speak for the township as far as what that is all the time or anytime, but at that listening session that the commissioners had sponsored in West Willow, that was one of the first times where this is Ypsi Township. They really got Ypsi Township residents together and where we could have a discussion. So I'm really thankful for that. But to answer your question, why, as a community member, why many residents felt the need to form a Whitetown ARPA committee or to inform that ARPA discussion is because there's distinct neighborhoods, census tracts, qualified census tracts, neighborhoods, voting precincts, specific areas that have longstanding health disparities, longstanding disparities in law enforcement, longstanding disparities in housing. And many of those neighborhoods, and if you look at, I think we're all familiar in this ARPA discussion with the Opportunity Index. If you're not, please Google Opportunity Index in Washtenaw. But what it does is give measures of the disparities that I'm talking about. And the first one, there's a new one that's out that came out last year. The first iteration of that was in 2016. And I mentioned in my introduction first here at 10 that I serve with the health department on a Community Voices for Health Equity team. That team is comprised of people that live in those different areas. So those disparities that I mentioned, there's a community of folks that have been focused in those areas in health, housing, law enforcement, in those specific neighborhoods that felt like that they're not really informing the discussion as much as they should, or not or not thought of by office holders as much as they should, and not addressed. And when we talk about zip codes 48198, 48197, a lot of those neighborhoods are in there, specifically in Ypsilanti Township, 48198 north of Ford Lake. That's where West Willow sits. I think it's, I'm a resident of West Willow, community member. The reason I mention it though, is because I'm informed because I grew up there and I know that specific story, but it mirrors many other areas in the township that the community members that helped start ARPA really don't feel like our township government and other officials have been listening to. And when I say mirrors, I'm like, West Willow is about 1,200 homes. It was built just immediately post-World War II. There were 2 elementary schools that were part of the neighborhood structure. Those have since closed down. So that absence of community space for parents and residents to get to know each other, youth programming to take place, that's gone. And I haven't seen, and many residents hadn't seen, the kind of response to township government in those areas that would make them think that the funding would be really focused as much as it should in those areas. So in that work with the health department, one of the people that I came in contact with is my co-chair of the Whitetown ARPA Committee, Alicia Dyer. She's a former deputy with the County Sheriff's Department, also receiving her master's in public policy and social work. I first met her about 4 years ago when I was working with the health department. She had put together a meeting of professionals to help the Sheriff's Department have ACEs-informed, trauma-informed response to incidents where children were present. The ACEs is an adverse childhood experience index. And what it does is measure different points of childhood trauma. And with that measurement, we can predict long-term health outcomes. But I mentioned that because she's my co-chair. And so we're really informed about what was going on in those specific census tracts and areas. So out of that experience, that's how our group formed. It also recognizing that disconnect between township government, other office holders listening to our areas, we felt like if we're going to do outreach, and I'll get to that second part of your question, in specific outreach, we want to get to those spaces where people just aren't talked to, but really populated by township residents. So doing outreach at some local grocery stores, some different convenience stores, also bus stops are a great place to see a lot of people that are affected by these issues and come up in the numbers, but their story isn't really understood and doesn't inform that decision-making narrative as much as it should. So those kinds of things are what we have planned and what we've done a little of. I say we're moving at the speed of capacity. I'm a community member. All of us, Ypsi Township community is a working class community, and it's working class people with families, responsibilities, full-time jobs or several part-time jobs make up many of those numbers. When you look at how COVID was impacted countywide, you'll see just the exponentially high disproportionate difference in 48197, 48198. So we're that community that's suffering from those challenges. So when I say speed of capacity, it's recognizing all that and doing the best we can in that environment. And one big part also is understanding so many people are not part of the social media discussion. And, that's such that can drive the discussion so much, but I don't know if it's recognized how much, like when I say Ypsi Township, 55,000 people, what percentage of those people, especially in those, the census tracts in the areas, the most challenged that I talked about, how many of those people are on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and the different things? A very low amount, but they're really affected, especially our senior population and others too. Like initially before getting in this work in ARPA, I assumed that it was mostly the older population that wasn't on social media, but no, there's a lot of busy people that are not even interested in social media at all because they're so engaged with their family and other responsibilities. So keeping all that in mind, we want to think of creative ways to get that input, have it represent Ypsilanti Township as best we can, and that's by having a diverse group of people. We have a great group of African-American, non-POC. I'm trying to get away from saying white, non-POC, LGBTQI+, indigenous population, the Spanish-speaking community. We have great representation because all those communities really represent Ypsilanti Township. So I have questions for others and more thoughts, but those are some of the actions that we're taking in the way that we're looking at this ARPA discussion and impacting it.
Thank you, Alex. So we do have a new panelist who joined us, Assistant City Administrator, Mr. Fournier. We're going through, we did a brief introduction at the beginning, and we're going through and giving the brief 5-minute story of how we're thinking as a jurisdiction about the spending timeline and community engagement. And so we've heard from Commissioner Shink and community member Alex Thomas. We're gonna go to Trustee Lindke now from Superior Township, and then we'll wrap up with you so that you can give your introduction as well as the story. So thanks, Trustee Lindke.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm following what Commissioner Shink said and Mr. Thomas. You both talked about things that we're doing in Superior Township. So this is great that I'm going third. Bottom line is that we wanted to hear the voices that we tend not to hear. In Superior Township, whenever there's an issue, we hear from people that are north of Getty's Road. So Getty's Road is sort of a dividing line, and we don't hear from the people south of Gettysburg, where our population density is. So as we were starting to talk about ARPA funds, we were following what the county was doing. Superior Township didn't need to focus as much on broadbanding. We found that only, I don't think what we heard is that a handful, like fewer than 5 people needed broadbanding services in the way that places in the county, the rural areas in the county did, other rural areas. So we weren't going to do that. As we were hearing from people, and this is through listening sessions that we attended, that we sort of piggybacked on what the county was doing when they came out and had a couple of the listening sessions in Superior Township. We were able to go there and pretty much heard exactly what Commissioner Shink said, which was that people were concerned that they didn't have a community center. They didn't have a place where they could connect with each other, which would offer a broad-based services, both from to serve children up to seniors. And that just kept coming out again and again and again, particularly at those listening sessions and at our public participation times during our meetings. So as we were talking about it, and it's still in the early stages, and you see that we have till the end of 24 to allocate those funds, and then a couple of years after that to spend. We felt that we had enough information that we wanted to just concentrate our funding on the qualified census tract areas. And that was before the final rule came out, where it became very broad. Apparently some of the municipalities were having difficulty in figuring out how they were going to fund it. We don't. We wish we had more money. So we decided that we would offer up a resolution where 100% of the funding would go to those. It's really about a 2 mile square mile tract, and we still have time to figure out what we're going to do with the fund. What we're going to spend it on. Our community, particularly, I think the primary thing that kept coming up was a community center. Then there were things like sidewalk repair. There's an area in one of our neighborhoods where there's a real issue of speeding. So just something simple like speed bumps that they wanted. And then there's some issue with getting more people into the neighborhoods to help a particular neighborhood with crime. So we're just in the beginning of this. We want to make sure that we're very focused on what we do, and that we help that population that really needs it most. We're also looking at equity. If you look at our historical funding of what we've been doing in Superior Township historically, and where the money has been going, for some infrastructure things, that townships do, or land preservation, we just think it's a no-brainer to support a community that doesn't always get resources. It's interesting when you were talking about, Mr. Thomas, when you were talking about how you're going to do outreach at bus stations or grocery stores.
Alex, please, Alex.
Alex, okay. These are areas where we need to be more deliberate in seeking out voices. When you have a group of people who have never been heard, or feel like they're not getting heard, and they don't really understand our way of, we want public participation, they may not come to our meetings. We've found that we had to go to them just to say, hey, we're having a meeting, we'd love to hear your voice. And there was hesitancy at first, where what difference will my voice make? Well, we're trying to show that their voices do make a difference, and we are hearing them, and we want to do something that's very good for that community. And by the way, our funding is only I want to say it's 1.49. It's a drop in the bucket. We're not able to do a whole lot, but it's a drop in the bucket. And Ingrid, I have a question for you. I've been reading about the bipartisan infrastructure deal that was just passed, and I'm trying to find out if the funding for that is distinct from the ARPA funding. From everything I see, it looks like it is. Is that correct?
Well, I can only speak to the ARPA funding.
Okay. So this is just, there's been a lot of news articles just last week about the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which will send to the state monies for broadband. So I was wondering if that's distinct, how communities can then use those funds in replacement of the ARPA funds. Okay.
Commissioner Shink, do you have an answer to that, or?
Yeah, so it is distinct and it'll come a different way. And when we made our allocation, we did it in a way that we thought, based on our best guess, would make it flexible so that if we could attract infrastructure money, that we could swap it out for the ARPA money, and then we could use more of the ARPA money for other things. We don't really know at this point whether that will truly happen or not, but we're trying to make it happen.
Right. It actually, as I was reading the articles, it looked like there would be a way to do that, which would just make your ARPA funds go that much further. So I think there's such exciting, these are exciting times. I also wanted to I know this is sort of a plug for PBS, but there was a show on earlier this week called Owned, A Tale of Two Americas. And it talks about the disparate ways we as a society have allocated funds to white America versus Black America. And I think we see that very much in our township. And I'm glad that at this point in my life, we can do something that makes a little bit of a difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Trustee Lindke, for sharing your story as a township and how you thought about engaging community members to help make your decisions. Mr. Fournier, please correct me if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but please introduce yourself and your role, and then give us the story of, as you knew these funds were coming in 2021, how did you begin thinking about the process of doing community engagement and getting community feedback to make the decisions? And then we'll talk after your response, we'll talk a little bit about methods and some other questions, and then we'll take some questions from the floor.
Sure. Well, my name's John Fournier, or Fournier. I answer to both, so it's really fine. And I'm the Assistant City Administrator for the City of Ann Arbor. And I'll apologize for my tardiness. I have a 1-year-old daughter, and sometimes you work more on their schedule than the other way around. So thank you for your patience. But the prioritization of our funds, I will just start by saying, is really came to us at the direction of our city council, who asked us late last year, for staff to identify projects that would be eligible under the federal funding, and that we as staff might recommend be prioritized. And so that was the first thing that we did. Is we thought it would be really important to look through the federal regulations, look through prior direction that the council has given us on other, big projects where we should be putting our resources, and to try to put together a matrix of projects that we can have a discussion around in the community. And that resulted in about $55 million worth of projects. The city of Ann Arbor has received or will receive in the second tranche a total of $24.2 million. And so we identified a pretty big pool of projects, and really paid attention to things in the federal regulations, like finding ways to provide direct aid to households, finding ways to bolster human and social services. And then we looked at the council direction that we have, and our city council it has very strongly endorsed work toward developing affordable housing. Our council is very supportive of multimodal transportation, things like Vision Zero implementation and bike infrastructure and things like that. And our council is very supportive of climate action through our A20 plan. That's really oriented a lot of the work of city council. And so we tried to put together, a whole slew of projects that would fit into those categories. Once that was provided to council, the council said, great, now let's do a big public engagement campaign, which we're just at the tail end of right now. We put together 10 community meetings. We have an online survey, and we've tried to cultivate in those meetings really, deliberate discussions about each project. Our meetings were themed so that we said, if you're interested in these 2 or 3 projects, come to this meeting and we'll have staff there and we can have an in-depth discussion about them. And then we had just some general town halls tacked on there as well, so that we could get generalized feedback. And our survey at this point, I think we have 2,500 responses. It is up until the end of the day on Monday. So we're expecting a few more to roll in, and we've also asked members of the public to provide their own ideas and their own suggestions about how we could be spending the money, and we have a handful of interesting suggestions that have come in from the community that we're evaluating. And so the end of this process is going to be staff looking at the results of our community engagement process, looking at the results of our survey, and providing what I'm calling a final draft recommendation to the council by March 1st. And then it's really in the council's hands. The council will be able to look at that recommendation, look at projects that maybe didn't make it into the recommendation that they feel should have, make whatever changes they would like, and then adopt a final spending plan sometime this spring. I'm sure this has been brought up, but we're all on the clock. We've got until the end of 2026 to spend all this money. Some of the projects we've identified, we're confident we can get them done in that time, but we really need to get direction from our council and start moving on them in order to meet that timeline. So people will see a flurry of activity, I think, in Ann Arbor and I know in our neighboring communities as well between now and 2026 to get these funds spent.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for giving us that overview of the community engagement so far. So it sounds like, earlier I mentioned I'd like to talk a little bit about methods of community engagement. For folks who don't know, I am actually an instructor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and part of what I teach is about community engagement and community organizing. And so I'm watching all the different methods that are used. I've heard survey mentioned for the county and the city, but I don't think I heard it mentioned for either township. Is that right?
That's correct from Superior Township. We were getting feedback from some of our folks that the surveys that they had been doing weren't that wasn't the best way to get information, put it that way. So we went ahead and we're hearing, we're hearing from people during public participation. We're hearing from people in the community that call us. There's a group of people that are very active in helping lift voices. So we're doing it that way. We're also in the midst of our master plan. Redoing our master plan in Superior Township. So there's already there's been surveys out there. There's an AATA survey out there. So we figured that there's we'll try to get it more from talking to people and encouraging people to come forward at our meetings.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, our Whitetown ARPA committee is considering, and I think we will eventually end up surveying. But as what I was saying before, not wanting the social media discussion to drive things and decisions. Right now, when we're out, we do have on social media, you can join our group, but we've been doing that outreach, at stepping into local businesses outside of some grocery stores and convenience stores. And that outreach has been just consistent of letting people know that they're in Ypsi Township, letting people know about the American Rescue Plan, letting people know that there are just a little of that, it's such a void in media So I grew up when there was an Ypsilanti press here, and there was a story that people could see themselves in and have an idea. And it was a different time and how we got news at being 52 years old myself now. But that outreach is just educating people about that local story and ARPA and inviting them in. And we've just got some just really enthusiastic responses.
Well, thank you. So you were just talking about doing outreach, and we heard Trustee Lindke talking about that before too. Commissioner Shink or Mr. Fournier, do you want to talk at all about outreach or going to people in the ways that you've been able to do that in your areas?
So I could talk just a little bit more about when we did our, we called it our deeper engagement, when we actually went into the neighborhoods to talk to people in their own neighborhoods, because that was very different. Like I'm not proud of this, but I will say, like, for my virtual town hall, not that many people came, like maybe 10, and they were mostly a group of people who had decided to come to this one. I don't even think a lot of them lived in my district. So it was, we were trying to move fast and trying to figure out virtual or in person. I think now going forward, we'll probably try to do more in person because COVID sort of calmed down. But we met in churches. So we figured out, like, what was a place. I mean, obviously we have to find someone who is willing to host us, but what's a place where we think people will be comfortable coming. And then we did have social media outreach, but we also had community outreach. So either volunteers or community health workers who were willing to help us get the word out. And then, and we also worked really hard to make it convenient. And at some of them we had refreshments, some of them we didn't. Mostly it was cold. Well, we were all sitting there cold and hungry, which I think made people more cranky. But there were restrictions. And then I would say, in terms of methods, like, we're pretty sure that the way we did this, we didn't catch enough young people, and we didn't really catch as many people who don't usually go to meetings as we would like. So I think, every time we've gone through a funding round, we've reevaluated what we've done and said, what can we do better? So we're about to vote on round 2, and then we'll be starting to work on round 3. And I anticipate that we're going to be doing more outreach and trying to improve upon what we did the last times.
Thank you. Mr. Fournier, do you want to describe some of the outreach or going to the people that you've been able to do?
Sure. So we're, I talk a lot with our staff in City Hall about making sure that we get outside of what I call the STP, which is the same 30 people, right? And that's a problem in local government. Is that you get the same faces over and over again, and their voices are just as valid as everybody else's. Don't get me wrong, but we have 125,000 people in Ann Arbor. We're, the largest city in the county. I like to think about our community, not just in terms of residents, but all the people who work here too, and all the people who come here to recreate and think really expansively about what the definition of community is in the city. And so we've, over the last probably 2 years, we've invested a lot of resources in our equitable engagement project, which is finding ways to break out of that STP and to reach communities in Ann Arbor that are harder to reach and are less likely to participate in our engagement campaigns. And so, some of the things that we did this time for the ARP funding, we did postering, which we found, like, it's such an old school method for bringing people to engagement, but we found that it's actually really effective for us. And the 3 languages spoken in Ann Arbor that are most common that aren't English are Spanish, Chinese, and Russian. And so we have multi-language posters that we were putting up around City Hall and around the community and at our recreation facilities and things like that. We also have A2 Open City Hall is the platform we use for our online engagement for our survey tools in particular. And one of the things we really like about that platform is you have to register to use it. So it really cuts down on kind of repeat survey takers. But also, once you register, you get an email notification for every single survey we put up. And we have, like, I think at this point, 6,500 people who get notified right away when we put a new survey up. And we have tried really intentionally to cultivate that list to be more representative of the community as a whole, and not, not reflective of the STP and the same faces that you see at our council meetings. And so that's one of the reasons why we get such great engagement with our online survey tools, and why it's kind of a go-to for us. And we also, some of the funding that we recommended, for instance, we recommended a pot of money for property acquisition for affordable housing. Well, we really wanted to make sure that our affordable housing providers in the city were aware of that, and they helped cultivate people to come to our community meetings, right? And we also proposed additional funding for our coordinated funding efforts that we do jointly with the county. And so agencies that benefit from coordinated funding really turned out and brought people to our community meetings. You know what I mean? So it's the same thing with our carbon neutrality projects. Like we tried to tap into constituencies who would be most likely to benefit or most affected, and kind of help them amplify the work that we were doing for our engagement. So
thank you. So I was actually going to ask a question about other languages besides English. So thank you for bringing that up. I know you said in Ann Arbor, the most common languages are Spanish, it's Mandarin Chinese, right? And Russian.
Mhm.
What are some of the things that other community areas are working on to reach people who don't speak English as their first or predominant language?
Well, I mentioned that our Whitetown ARPA committee is doing outreach to business owners. There's a Arabic or Arabic speaking, but Middle Eastern community, and there's some really prominent business owners in Ypsilanti Township. There's also a mosque on Ford Boulevard in Ypsi Township, and just there's a significant Arabic speaking community that I think that's part of the community story that there are a lot of opportunities for better outreach and connection with.
We have not, oh, sorry. Okay, we have not done that yet in Superior Township, but I am certainly taking notes, and this is a good idea for sure.
We had, I believe we had the survey available in Spanish, and we had some materials in Spanish, but I will just say, frankly, I think we need to do a better job.
Me too.
I wonder if there's a way that some folks could work together. I know, Mr. Fournier, you said there's some non-English language materials that you've shared. You mentioned 3 languages. Alex, you mentioned another language. Maybe there's a way to kind of cross-fertilize with some of this and some of the different jurisdictions, and see if we can really do some more outreach to folks in non-English languages. Because you can imagine that a lot of the folks who don't speak English don't see what's being published and publicized. So thank you, everybody, for being willing to work together on that. That's fantastic.
I thought Commissioner Shink put a great suggestion. The Peace Neighborhood Center would be a great place to have kind of conversations like this. I think in that these issues cross all these jurisdictions. And the people interact in their specific spaces, but a place to really have that dialogue to foster that collaboration, not just with ARPA, but in general. I said a part of our outreach has been just letting people know they're in Ypsi Township. There's many, and I respectfully in the Ann Arbor crowd, that are just surprised when I tell them, the Ypsi Township's 55,000. Just how that plays out in our last presidential election. Countywide, there were 217,000 ballots cast. 30,000 of those were in Ypsilanti Township. And so that wakes up a lot of people around the county and understand how significant that area, but our area is. But I mean, the whole county, so important. There's a lot of voices that aren't included. So we can't be tethered to the traditional ways of trying to do outreach and thinking.
Yes, that's a really great point. I love your point about telling people that they're in Ypsi Township, because I live right at the very edge of the city of Ann Arbor, and it only takes me a couple minutes walking to be in Scioto Township. And so I think people who have a address that has a certain city listed might not know if they're not in that city, or where their specific jurisdiction is, because we don't have lines on the roads, right? So
Right.
unless you kind of work in local government, you don't think about which township you're in necessarily. So that's really important for folks to know their positioning and what they do have influence on. So thank you.
Locally, thank you. And locally, when we think of Pittsfield Township, it's about 38,000 people. One of the they, in that ARPA discussion, they committed all of their funding to infrastructure, by the way, but also we had a really hearty discussion countywide about the district boundaries. And because at our county commissioners district, we're being redistricting was going on among the 9 county commissioners and deciding those new lines. In that conversation, I was surprised to find out within Pittsfield Township, there's about 20,000 people between Gulfside and 23. So about 20,000 people east of 23. A lot of them think they live in Ypsilanti. Really.
I mean, their address says Ypsilanti, right? And it has a 97 or 98 zip code. So it's how do you know exactly where you are? Yeah.
So it's a big education process, but we got to get those voices in.
Thank you. So, please, Commissioner Shink.
So one thing I forgot to add is when we were going to these community meetings, we did it differently than we had done with our town halls. And we got as many commissioners as who could make it on that day. And we noticed it as a public meeting. We got as many commissioners as we could so that people knew that the full capacity, the full decision-making capacity of the county was there. Because one commissioner can have all the best ideas in the world, but if their colleagues don't go along with them, it doesn't really make a difference. But when you have a majority of the commissioners there all sitting there nodding their heads, that's a different story. You know that you have the decision-making force of the Board of Commissioners there. And it meant a lot to people.
That's a really great point. I'm curious, Mr. Fournier, is that something that's been able to happen with the city, with the council at all? I don't know if there's the similar kind of community meetings.
So council members attended the community meetings at their own discretion. And I think we had at least one council member at each one. And we recognized them and invited them to speak and things like that. But the meetings that we did were mostly staff led. Myself, Marty Prashan, who's our chief financial officer, and we have an engagement team, Heather and Kayla, who actually facilitate our public engagement meetings and do a really great job. So they also led those meetings. And when we did the project specific meetings, the staff members who were involved in those projects were also front and center.
Great, thank you. So we do have a few minutes left in our meeting. I did put a note in the chat for folks. If you have questions in the audience, please add them to the chat. You can also raise your hand or unmute. I do have one final question that I wanted to ask about how you are as groups either planning on incorporating the community input or planning on making sure your community input is included. So, Alex, that's for you since you're not actually like the elected decision maker. So how are you, let's start with you and then we can go through the other panelists. And then if anybody has any other questions, we can check the chat box.
Well, thank you. After discussing with my co-chair and just our group as a whole, we really recognize that we're strongest the more people that we have, and the more people that are informed are part of the discussion. So it's educating those people now, getting as many people and as broad a diverse group of residents that we can, and then soliciting that opinion in some way as far as what are their most important concerns, some of the things that we've all talked about here, and using those methods, find out what those concerns, and then make some recommendations to our township board. So that's the plan and what we're executing now.
Thank you. Trustee Lindke, how are you planning on incorporating any further or previous community input into the decision making for actual allocations?
I think we are going to be very open to continuing to hear our residents. I would like to go back and talk to the board about the value, if they see a value of doing some surveys in addition to the ones that we already have. but I think I'm excited because there are quite a few people, quite a few voices, more than the STP that we're hearing from. And I don't think that that's been the case in Superior Township in the past. There are board members that speak out, that go out. Lynette Finlay, the clerk, was at the Christian Love Church and was the first to say, you know, we've got to get a community center for our residents. They keep coming to us wanting, you know, saying that this is a need, and it's time to listen. It's time to listen, and it's time to put our money to action. And so I think we'll be very open and inclusive.
Thank you. And I see you're off mute, Commissioner Shink.
Oh, I've already talked a lot about it. You know, I think that the important thing for us is we're trying to do a lot. We have a lot of money, and we're trying to be, in some ways, everything to everybody. Obviously, at some point, we're going to have to make decisions. I mean, we have been. We're going to have to say, yeah, we can't do this through this, and we have on a number of things. But just trying to continue to keep an open mind and see how the things are working out. We actually have enough time now, I think, to understand whether the $8 million that's going to go into the community priority fund, is that enough? If it's not enough, maybe we can put more in. If the broadband affordability is not enough, maybe we can put more in. We've got time, and we want to take the time to make sure that we listen. And we're going to keep continuing to try to improve our community outreach, because it's just so fruitful. You know, we've heard from people who say things like, I've lived here my entire life, and nobody from the county's ever come and asked my opinion before. And it's like, yeah, like this is, you know, this is important stuff, because everybody who lives in our community is important to our community, and we need to understand what's going on and what people's needs are. And if there are things that aren't being addressed, now it's the best time we're going to have in our lifetimes to address them.
Thank you. Mr. Fournier.
Sure. So, you know, one of the things we talk about when we're putting a public engagement campaign together in City Hall is that we really need to make sure that we're asking questions and eliciting feedback that is actually going to matter. You know, the worst thing that you can do is ask the community to weigh in on something and then ignore them if you don't like the answer, right? And so you know, our survey results, I think, are going to be really valuable for us. I was actually, Ingrid came to our last engagement session, and she and I had a conversation about data visualization and how we're going to visualize the survey results so that it's really relevant for the community and for decision makers. And so, you know, it's on the one hand, there isn't like a formula that we're just plugging the community engagement results into and it's automatically going to output a recommendation. But on the other hand, you know, there are themes that have emerged from our public engagement campaign that we are hearing loud and clear. And we've had a lot of conversation internally about making sure that feedback is reflected in the final draft recommendation. Because it's important. It's really important to tell your community that it mattered. We listened and it mattered. And so I think members of the Ann Arbor community will see that when the final draft recommendation goes to City Council.
Thank you. We do only have just a couple minutes. Ingrid, as who kicked us off for this panel, do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
I just really want to applaud the members on this panel for their hard work in what they're doing. Bernice, I have knocked doors in your community when I worked on the census, and I know how difficult it is to make outreach in your community. And Sue, doing the paper outreach is also super important. So thank you for acknowledging that we have to make outreach in all kinds of ways. And grocery store, I mean, you know, it's the creative process. We have to include everybody. And I love that everybody's making all these you know, and the languages. I mean, everybody has really done a stellar job. So as an urban planner, yay!
Yes, thank you so much, panelists, for joining us early in the morning on a Saturday morning and sharing how you're doing community engagement and really trying to listen to folks on the ground with how we can serve them with these really nice opportunity to have funding going to our community. So thank you. If we were in person, you would be hearing applause. I'm going to stop the recording and thank you again.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.